They whispered her name like it was something cursed. At Mel's diner, the woman in long sleeves moved through the aisles like a ghost, scarred, silent, and subject to the daily cruelty of strangers who judged what they didn't understand. For 3 years, Sarah Miller wore her pain under fabric, endured sideways glances, smirks, and dropped coins that clattered to the floor like insults. Her hands bore the story, but no one ever cared to hear it. Until today, when one careless shove from a man in a reflective vest sent her stumbling backward, her mask, built with quiet endurance over years, split open. The sleeve slipped. The ink revealed itself. A tattoo, stark and unmistakable. Military, unit-specific, and it didn't go unnoticed. In the corner booth, a man who'd sat quietly for hours froze mid-sip. The cup trembled in his hand. That single flash of ink pulled him from memory into revelation. Michael Kelly hadn't expected to find what he'd been chasing for nearly 2 decades sitting across the room, refilling coffee and pretending to be invisible. But the second he saw that mark, every assumption he'd clung to shattered like glass. Michael hunched over the chipped Formica table, the same one he'd claimed just as the morning rush began, when the coffee was still hot and the air wasn't yet thick with the stink of fried bacon and small-town boredom. His third cup had gone cold, untouched for the last hour. In his pocket was a photograph so worn it felt like cloth. Faded camo uniforms, sun-hardened faces, and memories of the desert heat. July 2006. The day everything detonated and left behind only silence and scars. His eyes had been tracking Sarah for hours. There was something in the way she moved. Economical, controlled. The kind of precision you only get trained into you. A subtle scan of the room every few minutes. Eyes shifting just enough to check exits and threats. Always keeping her left arm angled slightly out of view. Always layered up, despite the fan blades spinning overhead doing nothing against the heat. Those habits don't fade, and they don't come from waiting tables. Michael's mind looped through the moments again and again. The moment the blast hit. The fire. The door that wouldn't open. His own panic, caged inside a flaming Humvee. And then her, a shadow in the smoke. Strong hands, calm voice, dragging him through a window barely large enough for a child. She'd gone back. God, she'd gone back for Thompson. And then the second explosion. Then darkness. The door to the diner slammed open. A bell jingled like a warning siren. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Chad Morrison swaggered in like a man trying to convince the world he was still relevant. Broad-shouldered, Branson construction shirt, gym-built arrogance oozing from every smirk. 2 other guys followed, laughing too loudly, eyes already scanning for entertainment. And Sarah had just walked into their line of fire. "Hot damn, boys," Chad barked, loud enough for the whole diner. "Look what we got here. You trying to sweat out a fever, sweetheart? What's with the long sleeves in July? Hiding something freaky under there?" Snickers echoed from his crew. Predictable. Unoriginal. Sarah didn't flinch. She approached with calm steps, notepad in hand, that same practiced mask pulled tight over her face. She didn't even blink. Michael watched her carefully. The tension in her shoulders was almost imperceptible. But he saw it, just as he saw her left hand never leave the cover of her pad. "Good morning, gentlemen. Can I take your order?" she asked, her voice flat polite. "Empty." Chad leaned back, loud and smug. "I got an idea. Why don't you start by telling us what kind of mess you're hiding under all that fabric? Burned yourself cooking meth? Cut yourself up for attention? Or just allergic to sunlight and dignity?" More laughter, this time from half the room. The other half suddenly became obsessed with their coffee, with menus, with a rain stain on the ceiling. Anywhere but the scene unfolding just feet away. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. That kind of cowardly stillness that lets men like Chad run wild unchecked. Michael clenched his fists under the table. His knuckles turned white. The sun pierced through the grime-stained windows, splitting the room in two, light and shadow, past and present. Sarah stood at the edge of both, her expression unshaken, her spine straight, her silence louder than Chad's taunts. But Michael could see it now. This wasn't just tolerance. It was battle-tested control. "You got nothing to say?" Chad continued, voice rising with frustration at her lack of reaction. "Come on, we're trying to have a little fun. Can't even pretend to be a good sport. Still nothing." That was when Chad crossed a line even his cronies weren't ready for. He pulled 2 crumpled bills from his wallet and tossed them at her feet. "There's your tip, sweetheart. Might help with some lotion or laser treatment. Can't imagine anything short of fire would mess you up that bad." The bills fluttered to the linoleum like dying leaves. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. Sarah bent down slowly, deliberately, picking them up with robotic precision. She didn't look at him, didn't speak. But when she stood, when she turned slightly to reposition her shirt, Chad reached out and shoved her back. The fabric slid. The sleeve rode up, and time cracked open. The tattoo, 3rd Infantry Division, Ramadi 2006, was inked into scarred skin. Battle-worn flesh healed by fire and willpower alone. The room inhaled as one. The silence was deafening. A young college kid in a nearby booth whispered, stunned, "That's military. That's a real unit." Eyes shifted. The energy changed. Something ancient and sacred had just been revealed, and it demanded reverence. Even the laughter from Chad's crew stuttered and died. But Chad didn't notice, drunk on his own authority, blind to the storm forming around him. He pointed at the ink, sneering. "What is this now? Playing dress-up? Let me guess. Bought that online with your fake medals? Seen your type before. Stolen valor losers pretending to be something they never had the guts to be." Michael had already stood up. His chair hit the floor behind him. He walked toward the table, past tables of frozen faces and held breaths. His eyes locked on the tattoo, on the scars, on the truth. His mind was already there, back in Ramadi, back in the fire. "3rd Infantry," he said softly. But the room heard him. "Ramadi, summer, 2006. The words were keys. And Sarah's body responded before her mind could stop it. A flicker in her posture. Her eyes met his. Recognition blooming, then dread. Michael stopped a few feet away, hands trembling. His voice cracked with memory. "You pulled me out of the fire." He pulled out the photo, fingers trembling. Held it up. "I've been searching for you for 18 years. Sarah didn't speak. Her sleeve was still rolled up, her scars fully exposed. But it didn't matter anymore. Michael looked at her like someone witnessing a miracle. "Sergeant Sarah Miller," he whispered, "you saved my life." And the diner, once filled with cruelty and silence, stood witness to the quiet unraveling of a forgotten hero's disguise, and the moment the truth refused to stay buried. The name hit her like a shell blast. She stood there, motionless, a battlefield of emotion warring behind her eyes. Michael's voice had cut through years of silence, through layers of anonymity she had wrapped around herself like armor. He had spoken her rank like it was holy, not realizing how many times she had buried it. Sergeant Sarah Miller. The name hadn't been spoken aloud in years. Not since the discharge papers, not since the hospitals, not since she walked away from a world that decorated her and then forgot her. The diner had transformed. Every sound seemed distant now. The hiss of grease on the griddle, the clink of forks, muted beneath the thunder of history rising from the scars on her skin. The tables weren't tables anymore. They were foxholes, and the eyes that stared at her now weren't just curious. They were reckoning with something sacred. Chad finally noticed the shift. He looked around as confusion overtook his smugness. His laugh faltered when he realized nobody was joining in anymore. His crew had backed away slightly, avoiding his eyes. And Sarah, this woman he'd mocked, wasn't shrinking from him. She was staring through him. "What is this?" he asked, the cockiness still in his voice, but less certain now. "So you played soldier?" "Big deal." Michael turned slowly to face him. His jaw clenched with something cold and old. Something earned. "She didn't play soldier," Michael said, his voice no longer gentle. "She saved lives. Mine included. You want to talk about bravery?" This woman carried another man through fire while rounds were cooking off around her. You know what that means? Ammunition detonating from heat. She didn't run. She shielded us with her body. Sarah's hands had dropped to her sides now. No longer hiding. No longer retreating. The sleeves hung loose as she stood exposed in every sense of the word. Wounds and honors alike bared to a room that had never cared to ask before. "You don't know what sacrifice looks like," Michael continued. "But now you've seen it." The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was reverent. The older man with the cane had risen completely now, no longer held back by his wife's whispered concerns. He stared at Sarah with a tremble in his lip, and the kind of recognition only another veteran could possess. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, and she nodded back, barely, like two soldiers acknowledging battle from decades apart. Chad looked like he wanted to shrink, but his ego wouldn't let him. "Okay, fine," he snapped. "She was military. Big hero. Doesn't mean I did anything wrong. Joking around doesn't make me the bad guy." "You assaulted her," Michael said plainly. "That was barely a shove." "You put your hands on a decorated veteran," Michael said, stepping closer, the weight of righteous fury behind every word. "You mocked her scars. You mocked her trauma. You think the First Amendment gives you a pass on cruelty?" The cook had emerged fully now, his apron dusted in flour and grease, arms crossed over a chest as wide as a door frame. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The message was clear. Chad was no longer welcome here. "Maybe it's time you left," the cook said flatly, "before you embarrass yourself more than you already have." Chad's face flushed red with anger, but he knew. The energy had turned. He was no longer the lion here. He was the jackal, caught stealing from a shrine. He muttered something, no one cared what, and shoved past the tables toward the door. His crew followed, heads down, not laughing anymore. The bell above the door jingled again, as they vanished back into whatever small lives they came from. But no one in that diner would forget what they had seen. Michael finally stepped back, offering Sarah her space again. She hadn't said a word, not since her name had been spoken. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with adrenaline. Old instincts fighting to retake control. He gently placed the photograph on the counter beside her. The image was faded but unmistakable. Her face younger, unscarred, smiling through desert dust and exhaustion, surrounded by men who never made it home, and one who did because of her. "I didn't know how to find you," he said, voice low. "I checked every record I could get my hands on. I thought maybe you died. Until today." Her lips parted, words forming slowly as if they had to push through years of silence. "I didn't want to be found," she said at last. "That part of my life, I buried it, along with the names of everyone we lost. Michael's face softened. I get that, he said. Believeme, Ido. But maybe it's time you knew that what you did mattered. That someone remembers. Her eyes brimmed, but no tears fell. Sarah Miller didn't cry in public. She hadn't cried in years. But inside something cracked. Not a wound reopening, but a pressure finally releasing. From the far end of the diner, a slow clap began. Not theatrical, not mockery. It was the older man with the cane. Then his wife joined. Then a young woman in scrubs. And then others. One by one, the diners who had once looked away stood up. Applause wasn't loud. It wasn't boisterous. It was soft, reverent. A salute in the language of civilians who now understood what had stood in front of them all along. Sarah stood in the middle of it, not smiling, not grandstanding, but present. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to be seen. The applause faded, but the impact didn't. The diner had returned to quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of silence. It wasn't avoidance or shame anymore. It was reverence. It was respect. It was something close to awe. Sarah stood at the center of it all. Tattoo exposed, scars bared, truth no longer hidden. And she didn't retreat. Her chest rose with a deep breath, not shaky but steady. The kind of breath that signals a turning point. A decision. She slowly turned back to Michael. He hadn't moved. He stood like a soldier still at attention, his eyes locked on hers, not with pity or curiosity, but with recognition, with gratitude, with something else too, something older than words. I remember you, she said quietly, almost like a confession. You were in the back seat. You kept trying to kick the door open even after your leg was crushed. Michael gave a dry laugh, surprised. That sounds like me. You were shouting for Thompson, she added. You didn't stop screaming until I yanked you out. You came back for him, Michael said softly. You went back into the fire when you didn't have to. She nodded. I had to. He didn't make it. But I had to try. There was a long pause. People don't understand that kind of moment, Sarah continued. They think we're brave because we want to be. Truth is, we're just doing what we promised. That's it. That's all it ever was. Michael looked down at the photo, running a finger over the faded print. Some of us have been trying to live up to that promise ever since, he said. Carrying the guilt, the gratitude, the memory. It doesn't go away. No, Sarah agreed. It doesn't. A waitress from the next shift had arrived, hovering near the counter awkwardly, unsure of what she was walking into. The cook gave her a quiet nod and turned to Sarah. You can take the rest of the morning, he said gently. You earned that much. Sarah gave him a look, part protest, part gratitude, but she didn't argue. She untied her apron slowly, folding it with practiced precision and laying it on the counter. For a moment, she looked unsure of what to do with her hands. They were no longer hidden, no longer shielded by sleeves. They just were. Scarred, strong, real. She turned back to Michael. Walk with me? She asked. Anywhere, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. They stepped out into the sunlight, the door's bell chiming behind them like the final note of an old chapter. Outside, the heat was dry and buzzing. Cars passed on the highway. Nothing looked different, but everything had changed. For a few minutes, they walked in silence down the edge of the parking lot, past the rusted sign, past the sun-baked gravel, past the world that had never known her name. I never planned on staying here, Sarah said at last. Stopped to gas up once, broke down just outside of town. Took a job at the diner while I figured things out. That was 3 years ago. Michael nodded. Sometimes broken places feel safe. She smiled faintly. Yeah, hiding in plain sight. Why now? He asked. Why show yourself today? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted toward the horizon, where the hills rose like old bones under the sky. I think I got tired, she said finally, of pretending, of being invisible. I kept telling myself I was protecting something. My peace, maybe. My privacy. But today, that wasn't it. She turned to him fully now. Today, I realized I was hiding because I didn't want to be remembered. Michael studied her face, the calm in it, the fire still flickering behind her eyes. You didn't want to be remembered as broken, he said softly. She looked away. Or a ghost. He took a breath. But you're neither. Another silence. But this one wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. Open. You could come back, you know, Michael said carefully. There are groups. Reuniones. VA programs. You don't have to vanish. You don't have to carry it alone. She looked at him, really looked. For a long time, I didn't think I deserved to belong anymore, she said. Not after what happened. Not after who didn't come back. Michael nodded slowly. But you do. You earned it, Sarah. You gave everything. And you're still here. That matters. The weight of those words settled on her like armor being returned to the shoulders it was made for. She turned her hands over slowly, looking at them. The skin was mottled, raised in places where fire had kissed flesh and left its mark. But the strength in those hands had saved lives, had pulled men from death, had once carried an entire squad's hope through smoke and ash. I'm tired of pretending these are something to be ashamed of, she said, her voice firm now. They're proof, not punishment. Michael smiled. They're your medals, he said. The ones nobody can take. She smiled back, just a little. A truck honked in the distance. Somewhere behind them, the diner's door opened and closed. The world went on. But for Sarah Miller, something had shifted. A weight had lifted. Not erased, not forgotten, but finally shared.